From the moment Eleanor Hargrave stepped into the doorway of St. Aldrich's chapel, she knew with a cold, breathless certainty that she was walking toward a man who would destroy her, and that knowledge clung to her ribs like iron shackles as the organ began its solemn rise behind her. The veil brushed against her lips in a soft, silencing sweep, as if even the fabric understood she had no voice left in the life that awaited her. White marble glowed around her, lilies suffocated the air with sweetness she could not bear, and every pair of eyes lining the aisle, curious, pitying, hungry for scandal, felt like another weight pressing her further into the future she did not choose. Her mother's trembling fingers squeezed her arm, urging her forward with the desperation of someone who had run out of mercy to offer. Eleanor moved because she had no choice, each step a reluctant surrender to the fact that Lord Cedric Vale, Earl of Ashcombe, had bought her family's survival and claimed her as the cost. Cedric stood at the altar with the smile of a predator who believed he had already consumed his prey. His posture was impeccable, elegant even, but the glint in his eyes was sharp with triumph, possessive in a way that made Eleanor's stomach twist with dread. She had seen men celebrate victory before, over a horse race, a political maneuver, a risky wager, but never had she seen that same ruthless delight directed at her. She felt it, the moment his gaze locked with hers. She was not a bride, she was a prize, a possession, an acquisition. The whispers rippled through the pews, and for an instant Eleanor wondered if the walls themselves were leaning in to watch. But then, just beyond the nearest column, her eyes caught on a figure half wrapped in shadow. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravensford, stood like a carved piece of midnight, tall, severe, unmoving, his expression unreadable beneath the cathedral light. He had declined the wedding invitation, she was certain of it. Yet here he was, gaze fixed on her with an intensity that startled her breath. Was it concern? Was it anger? She could not decipher it, but something in his stillness steadied her for the briefest fraction of a heartbeat. Someone saw her, truly saw her. And then Cedric reached for her hand. His grip enclosed her fingers with bruising force, dragging her attention back to the altar and the priest, who began reciting the ceremonial words as if they belonged to a world she was no longer part of. The chapel blurred around the edges, sound muffled beneath the loud, panicked rhythm of her pulse. As Cedric's thumb pressed into her skin in a silent warning of ownership, Eleanor felt the truth solidify inside her. This marriage was not a beginning, it was captivity. And somewhere in the shadows, beneath the controlled fury in a watching duke's eyes, something dangerous and inevitable began to spark, something that would one day change the course of both their lives. The carriage ride to Ashcombe Manor was suffocating in its silence, a silence so taut that Eleanor could hear every uneven breath. Cedric took beside her, each one edged with a simmering impatience that made her spine tighten. She sat rigidly, hands folded in her lap, staring out the window as the world blurred into a smear of winter fields and pale sky, trying to anchor herself in anything that did not smell of leather, musk, and the cold control radiating from the man she was now bound to. Cedric had not spoken since leaving the chapel, but the quiet was not peaceful. It was expectant, coiled, waiting for a moment when he could unmask himself without witnesses. And Eleanor felt it, felt the dread crawling up her throat, felt the truth of what her life was becoming settling like an unwelcome ghost beside her, felt that each passing mile was not simply a distance traveled, but a step deeper into the shadows he already ruled. When the carriage finally stopped before the towering stone facade of Ashcombe Manor, Cedric stepped out first without offering a hand, as though she were a servant trailing behind him. The servants lined up stiffly in the entry hall, their eyes lowered, their bodies held in hushed tension. Not one dared meet her gaze for longer than a heartbeat, and the fear in their posture told Eleanor more than words ever could. This place was not simply his home, it was his kingdom, and within these walls, Cedric was not a restrained gentleman but something far more dangerous. He led her through the grand corridors with clipped, efficient strides, speaking only to outline the expectations he required of her. Punctuality, silence, obedience, and absolute discretion. His voice was low, measured, and disturbingly calm as he described the punishments for defiance, as if he were reciting the rules of a contract rather than addressing his new wife. Eleanor felt the cold begin to seep under her skin, deeper than any winter chill could reach. When they reached the master suite, Cedric closed the door behind them with deliberate slowness, the sound echoing with a finality that made her stomach knot. He stepped closer, lifting her chin with a touch that masqueraded as tenderness, but revealed the steel beneath his skin. "I do not tolerate disorder," he murmured, eyes narrowing in a way that made her feel stripped bare, "and I do not tolerate disobedience. You will learn quickly, Eleanor, or you will regret the time you waste resisting." The words slithered into her ears, chilling her from within. She fought to keep her posture steady, to nod without trembling, to hide the fear that threatened to spill through her composure. When he finally released her and left the room, she sank onto the edge of the bed, breath shaking, heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. Somewhere in the labyrinth of these cold corridors, her life had been swallowed whole. And miles away in London, Adrian Blackthorne lifted a glass of brandy to his lips and found himself thinking of her, of the tremor in her hands, of the fear she could not hide. He did not yet know why her memory lingered so sharply, but he sensed the wrongness of the marriage like a storm gathering at the edge of the horizon, and that thought alone made the drink taste bitter. Adrian Blackthorne had never been a man prone to restless pacing, yet that evening found him crossing the length of his study with a tension that refused to ease. The fire crackled steadily, throwing golden light across the shelves of leather, bound volumes and polished decanters, but none of its warmth reached him. He had spent the day hearing murmurs, some careless, some hushed, about Cedric Vale's temper, about the unease at Ashcombe Manor, and about the fragile new bride who had looked as though she were walking to the gallows instead of a marriage altar. He tried to push the image aside, but Eleanor's pale composure haunted him with an unwelcome persistence, a quiet plea wrapped inside the memory of her gaze. At last, as dusk thickened into night, Adrian's restraint fractured. He sent word demanding Cedric meet him at the Sterling Club, a place where nobles sharpened reputations as easily as blades. When Cedric arrived, he did so with the smug confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His coat was immaculate, his hair precisely arranged, but his eyes glittered with the restless vanity of someone who had something to prove. They stood in a room panelled with dark oak, surrounded by other gentlemen pretending not to listen. Adrian wasted no time. "Your wife," he began, his voice cool and cutting, seemed distressed on her wedding day. The statement was deliberate, provocative in its restraint. Cedric smirked, leaning against the polished mahogany bar with casual arrogance. "Distressed?" he repeated with a laugh that grated like broken glass. "My dear Eleanor is timid, but she will learn her place soon enough." The words slammed against Adrian's composure with chilling force. He stepped closer, his jaw tight, his tone dangerous in its quiet control. "You would be wise to remember that even timid wives are protected by the law, and by the men who notice when they are mistreated." The room fell still, voices dimmed, heads turned. Cedric's smile faltered for a heartbeat before twisting into something venomous. "I see," he murmured, eyes narrowing. "So, this is what interests you now? My bride?" The insinuation hung thick in the air, laced with a jealousy that bordered on paranoia. "Perhaps you wished for her yourself, Blackthorne. A tragic thing, that she chose me instead." Adrian's expression chilled into something glacial. "She chose no one," he said, his voice low, each word precise as a blade. Cedric's eyes flashed with a flicker of something dark, fear, anger, or perhaps recognition. Their rivalry had deep roots, tangled with old political clashes and personal grievances. Cedric stepped closer, lowering his voice until only Adrian could hear. "Be careful," he hissed. "Eleanor belongs to me, and if you interfere, you'll find I'm not as easily toppled as you imagine." Adrian did not flinch. "I do not imagine," he replied coldly. "I know." He left without another word, coat sweeping behind him like a shadow refusing to linger in a poisoned room. But as he stepped out into the crisp night air, one truth anchored itself firmly in his chest. Eleanor's fear had not been imagined, and if Cedric dared to harm her, their rivalry would become something far darker than political disdain. Ashcombe Manor revealed its darkness slowly, like a great stone creature waking from centuries of cold sleep, and within days Eleanor understood that the house itself was shaped by Cedric's cruelty. The servants moved like shadows, avoiding the light, carrying fear in their shoulders and silence in their eyes. Corridors twisted into forgotten corners where dust settled thick from neglect, while other rooms gleamed with obsessive precision, as though Cedric needed his surroundings to reflect an order he could not control in his own mind. Eleanor walked these halls with careful steps, memorizing the rhythm of servants' movements and the hours Cedric spent away in the evenings, searching for fragments of understanding in a life she had not chosen. It was during one of these solitary wanderings that she found herself outside Cedric's study, the door slightly ajar, a thin ribbon of lamplight spilling across the rug as though inviting her into danger. Her pulse raced. She knew better than to enter, knew the cost of being caught, yet something compelled her forward, an instinct that whispered knowledge might become her only defense. With trembling fingers, she eased the door open further and stepped inside. The room smelled of ink, tobacco, and secrets left too long in confined spaces. Papers were strewn across the desk, organized in a manner that suggested chaos disguised as order. Eleanor moved quietly, her gaze skimming ledgers, receipts, and letters sealed with symbols she did not recognize. And then she saw them, records written in Cedric's distinctive hand detailing transactions of alarming sums, names of men whispered about in gambling dens, and notes about debts collected through methods disturbingly vague, yet undeniably violent. Her stomach twisted as she read the lines, piecing together a truth far uglier than rumors whispered in London's parlors. A soft creak outside the door sent panic shooting up her spine. She hurriedly returned the documents to their exact places and slipped behind a heavy velvet drape just as footsteps approached. The door swung open. Cedric entered, muttering curses under his breath, pacing with agitated energy. She watched through a narrow slit in the fabric as he threw a glass against the wall, shards scattering like sparks. "Incompetent fools," he snarled to the empty room. "If they think they can betray me, they will learn what loyalty costs." Eleanor pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a gasp. She had heard anger from him before, controlled and cold, but this was something feral, unhinged, revealing the depth of the darkness she lived beside. When he finally left, she remained hidden until her trembling eased. As she slipped back into the corridor, her legs felt unsteady, not just from fear but from the knowledge that Cedric was not merely cruel, he was unstable, corrupt, and dangerous in ways she had not imagined. That night, as she lay awake in the vast silence of the manor, Eleanor realized that information could become her only weapon, and knowledge might be the first step toward survival. And though she did not know it, miles away Adrian Blackthorne sat at his desk, examining whispers of Cedric's dealings, both of them unknowingly inching toward the same revelation, that Cedric's world was built on secrets sharp enough to cut anyone trapped within it. Winter sunlight washed the Ashcombe gardens in a pale brilliance that made every trimmed hedge and frost-kissed rose glitter like glass, but Eleanor felt none of its beauty as she moved quietly through the winding paths. Cedric had insisted she host a gathering that afternoon, a parade of wealthy guests who praised the estate while barely concealing their greed. But once the last carriage departed, Eleanor slipped away, desperate for a moment where the air did not feel owned by someone else. Her breath clouded faintly in the cold as she wandered beneath the arched trellises, fingers brushing the edges of brittle leaves, her mind replaying the explosive rage she had heard from Cedric the night before. She needed silence, even a fragile sliver of it, before she collapsed beneath the weight of pretending. She rounded a corner, expecting solitude, but instead collided softly with a tall, dark figure whose presence arrested her breath. Adrian Blackthorne stood beneath the shadow of a rose arbor, his coat dusted with faint frost, his expression sharp with focus until it softened the instant he recognized her. The world stilled around them in a hush so complete Eleanor could hear her own pulse echoing in her ears. She hadn't expected him to attend the gathering, not after the tension of their last encounter at the Sterling Club, but now, seeing him here, she felt a tremor of something she hadn't allowed herself in weeks, the feeling of being noticed. Eleanor stepped back, smoothing her skirts in a nervous gesture that could not hide the bruise along her wrist, where Cedric's grip had turned violent earlier that day. Adrian's gaze flicked to it, and something in his eyes darkened, like a storm cloud forming beneath a calm sky. "Lady Ashcombe," he said quietly, voice low enough that no stray ear could catch the undercurrent of concern woven into the words. "Forgive me, I did not mean to startle you." "You did not," she replied, though her voice betrayed the fragile truth. I wished for air." He studied her for a moment, not with the curiosity of gossiping nobles, but with an attentiveness that felt dangerously close to understanding. "This place does not seem kind to you," he murmured, almost as though speaking to himself. The words tugged at the edge of her composure. No one had asked her how she felt, not since before the wedding, not since her family handed her over to Cedric's calculated mercy. She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching footsteps snapped the fragile moment like glass. Cedric emerged from behind the hedges, his smile taut, his eyes glinting with suspicion. He slid an arm around Eleanor's waist with a possessiveness that felt more like a shackle than an embrace. "Your Grace," Cedric drawled, "I hope my wife is not boring you with her delicate sensibilities." Adrian's jaw tightened, though his expression remained composed. Not at all. The lady was simply admiring the gardens. Eleanor felt Cedric's grip tighten, a silent warning disguised as affection. Adrian saw it. She knew he did. And in the fleeting second before Cedric led her away, Eleanor caught the promise burning in the Duke's gaze. Dangerous, determined, and unmistakably clear. He would not ignore what he had just seen. Cedric's mood shifted in subtle, dangerous ways during the days following the garden gathering, and Eleanor felt each change like the tremor before an earthquake, silent but unmistakably foreboding. He watched her now with an attentiveness that masqueraded as marital interest, yet carried the sharp edge of suspicion, as if he believed she were a puzzle with missing pieces he intended to force back into place. His questions became more pointed, his tone more brittle, the clipped rhythm of his voice revealing a man whose confidence was beginning to crack beneath unseen pressure. Eleanor responded with the gentle obedience he demanded, lowering her eyes when necessary, measuring each word as though her breath itself could ignite his temper, but Cedric seemed determined to find fault where none existed. The bruise on her wrist, already fading, became a symbol of the tightening rope around her life, and she learned quickly that he noticed everything, who she spoke to, how long she lingered in a room, whether her smile looked too practiced or not practiced enough. What unsettled Cedric most, though he would never admit it aloud, was the memory of Adrian Blackthorne standing in the winter garden, silent, composed, and unmistakably watching. Eleanor could see it in Cedric's eyes, the shadow of the Duke's presence haunting him with a mixture of rivalry and fear. Cedric had always despised Adrian with a fervor that bordered on obsession, fueled by old grudges and the sting of inferiority masked beneath arrogance. And now that Eleanor had been seen alone with him, even for a brief moment, Cedric's mind spun with paranoid narratives. He accused her, in sharp, hissing tones, of seeking attention, of inviting pity, of plotting to embarrass him. Eleanor denied each accusation calmly, reminding herself that any rise in emotion would only feed his fury. Still, Cedric's temper simmered like a pot left too long on the fire, ready to spill over at the slightest provocation. What Eleanor did not know was that Adrian had begun asking quiet questions of his own. From London to the countryside, whispers travelled fast, and the Duke listened to them all with a tightening jaw and a growing sense that Cedric's household was rotting from within. Servants tripped over their words when asked about Eleanor, careful not to say too much yet unable to hide their unease. Adrian noticed bruises on Cedric's knuckles when they crossed paths publicly, and the sight lodged itself in his mind like a shard of ice. The memory of Eleanor's fragile composure, of her wrist marked by a violent grip, returned to him with increasing force until he could no longer dismiss it as imagination. In Ashcombe Manor, the air thickened with a tension Eleanor could almost taste. Cedric's footsteps followed her like a shadow hungry for misstep, and his eyes gleamed with an anger that made her blood turn cold. She felt trapped in a shifting labyrinth, each corridor twisting with the threat of what Cedric might do next. And miles away, Adrian Blackthorne felt the unmistakable truth settle heavily in his chest. Something was happening behind the manor's locked doors, something Cedric intended to hide, and Eleanor's silence was beginning to speak louder than anything she could say aloud. Adrian Blackthorne had not intended to think of Eleanor Hargrave after the garden party, yet her image clung to his mind with an unwelcome persistence, settling into the quiet spaces of his thoughts like a whisper he could not ignore. He was a man who valued discipline as others valued wealth, a man who shaped his life through precision and restraint, leaving no room for vulnerability or distraction. But as he sat in his library, the evening light slanting gold across ancient maps and polished oak, he found himself tracing the memory of her voice, her trembling composure, the bruised wrist she had tried so carefully to hide. Each recollection stirred an uncomfortable tension inside him, a mixture of anger and concern that blurred into something he refused to name. He told himself he was merely troubled by injustice, yet even that felt like a shallow veil over the deeper pull drawing him toward her. He had spent years mastering the art of emotional distance, cultivating a reputation for unshakable composure that allowed no one to glimpse the vulnerable truths buried beneath his public exterior. But Eleanor's quiet suffering had slipped through that armored exterior, as though her fear had been crafted precisely to unravel him. He found himself replaying Cedric's arrogant smile, the possessive grip at her waist, the the flicker of pain in her eyes when Cedric tightened his hold. The memory sharpened Adrian's jaw and stirred a simmering fury he had not felt in years. It was irrational, dangerous even, but no amount of logic could dislodge it. He confided in no one except his trusted adviser, Lord Halston, who listened with raised brows and a sigh heavy with warning. "If you continue down this path," Halston murmured, swirling his drink thoughtfully, "you will find yourself at war with a man whose spite far exceeds his intelligence. Cedric Vale is driven by insecurity. To threaten his pride is to awaken a monster." Adrian leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, his expression unreadable. "I do not intend to fight him," he answered, though the edge in his voice betrayed the lie. "I simply intend to understand what Eleanor endures." But Halston saw more than the Duke wished to reveal. "Be cautious, Adrian. Emotional entanglements have consequences, particularly when danger circles so close." Adrian dismissed the suggestion outwardly, yet it lingered in his chest long after the conversation ended. He knew he was crossing lines he had sworn never to approach, and still, the memory of Eleanor's eyes, haunted yet quietly resilient, pulled him deeper into the storm. Meanwhile, in Ashcombe Manor, Eleanor felt Cedric's scrutiny tightening like a noose around her ribs. Each day his paranoia sharpened, and each day she found herself thinking, without admitting it aloud, of the Duke who had spoken to her with a gentleness she had almost forgotten existed. She chastised herself for the thought, reminding her trembling heart that longing was dangerous. Yet the fragile warmth he had given her lingered, a flicker of solace amid Cedric's rising storm. Neither of them knew it yet, but their quiet thoughts of each other were the first threads of a bond that would soon become impossible to sever. The dinner Cedric forced Eleanor to host felt less like a social gathering and more like a carefully staged performance where every smile was rehearsed, every gesture measured, and every breath a reminder of the consequences if she faltered. Ashcombe Manor, stripped of warmth, had been transformed into a glittering facade with chandeliers blazing and polished silver gleaming along the endless table. Guests arrived with the slick confidence of wealthy men who believed themselves immune to consequence, their wives trailing behind them like decorative echoes. Eleanor greeted them with flawless courtesy, her voice steady even as her pulse fluttered beneath her skin. Cedric hovered nearby, offering instructions disguised as affectionate whispers, the pressure of his fingers at her back, a silent warning that she belonged to him, body and reputation alike. The evening unfolded in a swirl of calculated laughter and empty toasts, each moment thick with the charade Cedric insisted they maintain. When Adrian Blackthorne arrived, his presence cut through the room like a blade of cold air slipping into overheated space. Clad in midnight black, he carried an aura of controlled authority that made heads turn and conversations falter. Eleanor felt his gaze before she dared meet it, a quiet weight that steadied her trembling breath, even as guilt flickered through her chest for welcoming it. Cedric, however, stiffened visibly, his smile stretching thin as parchment when he greeted the Duke. The two men exchanged the kind of bows that barely concealed disdain, each movement a silent duel of power and pride. Cecilia Marwood, one of the more perceptive guests, whispered behind her fan that the tension could crack the crystal stemware. Eleanor pretended not to hear. During dinner, Cedric performed his charm with exaggerated flourish, telling stories embellished beyond recognition while his guests nodded along in sycophantic admiration. But the illusion wavered whenever he addressed Eleanor. His remarks came tinged with condescension, veiled jabs wrapped inside compliments. "My wife has such delicate sensibilities," he said with a smirk, lifting his glass as if offering her frailty for their amusement. A ripple of polite laughter moved around the table. Eleanor lowered her eyes, forcing her lips into a gentle curve, though humiliation pulsed beneath her skin like an exposed wound. Adrian watched silently, his posture composed but his eyes darkening with each degrading word. Later, as guests drifted into smaller groups to gossip near the hearth, Cedric stepped aside to speak to a business partner, leaving Eleanor momentarily alone. Adrian moved toward her with the quiet decisiveness of a man crossing a battlefield. "Are you well?" he asked softly, the question simple yet laden with meaning. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a fragile steadiness. "I am," she whispered, because she could not afford anything else. But Adrian saw the truth beneath her calm, the tightness of her breath, the practiced serenity masking fear. Before he could speak again, Cedric reappeared at her side, his expression sharp with alertness. He placed his hand on Eleanor's waist, grip firm, a silent declaration of ownership. Adrian's jaw tightened, and for one charged heartbeat the two men locked eyes, each recognizing a challenge neither dared voice aloud. And in that moment, beneath glittering chandeliers and hollow laughter, something inevitable shifted in the shadows between them. When the final carriage rolled away, and the clatter of hooves faded into the cold night air, Ashcombe Manor exhaled a silence that felt almost mournful after the cacophony of forced laughter and insincere compliments. Eleanor remained in the grand hall long enough to ensure Cedric was occupied with seeing off his wealthiest guests, then slipped into a side corridor where candlelight flickered against stone walls and shadows pooled like spilled ink. She pressed her hand to her chest, breathing slowly, letting the exhaustion of the evening settle into her bones. In the quiet, she felt herself begin to unravel. The humiliation, the tension, the constant vigilance, it all pressed down like a weight she no longer had strength to lift. She brushed away the beginnings of tears, determined not to let them fall. She had learned long ago that weakness was a luxury she could not afford. She had just begun to steady herself when a familiar presence filled the corridor, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Adrian Blackthorne stepped from a dim alcove, his face half lit by the wavering candle flame. The air shifted around them, the quiet deepening into something intimate. He did not speak at first, simply studied her with that piercing stillness that always made her feel seen in ways she could not understand. "You look distressed," he murmured finally, his voice low enough to keep the shadows listening rather than the walls. "Had anyone else asked, I would have lied," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it firm. "But yes, I was." Adrian's expression tightened, not in pity, but in a restrained fury that simmered beneath the surface. "Cedric's treatment of you is unacceptable," he said, each word controlled yet edged with dangerous heat. Eleanor looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. "There is little I can do," she answered quietly. "You must not involve yourself. Cedric will not tolerate challenges." He stepped closer, not touching her, yet his presence alone felt like a shield against the cold. "Eleanor," he said softly, her name falling from his lips with surprising gentleness, "you should not face this alone." Something inside her nearly broke at those words. She had endured months of isolation, of forced silence and swallowed fear, and the mere suggestion of support felt like sunlight striking frozen ground. But before she could speak, a sudden burst of footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. Instinctively, Adrian stepped back into shadow, vanishing with a swiftness that made her heart clench. Cedric appeared seconds later, eyes sharp, smile razor-thin. "There you are," he said, as if he owned the very air she breathed. "I wondered where you'd wandered off to." Eleanor forced a calm smile, burying the truth beneath layers of practiced composure. "I needed a moment," she said softly. Cedric studied her for a beat too long, suspicion glinting like a blade. But at last he turned away, beckoning her to follow. As she walked behind him, she could feel Adrian's presence lingering in the dark, a silent vow forming in the space he'd left behind. Eleanor did not see him, but she sensed it. Something between them had shifted irrevocably. Cedric Vale was not a man inclined to introspection, yet in the days following the dinner, he found his thoughts circling the same unsettling idea with increasing agitation. Adrian Blackthorne had been watching Eleanor. The realization festered like a splinter he could not remove. Rumors whispered by so-called friends, the lingering stares he had caught between them, the way Eleanor's breath seemed to change when the Duke entered a room, it all coiled into a suspicion Cedric could no longer ignore, and suspicion, in his hands, became something far more volatile. One evening, as the manor lay wrapped in cold shadow, he summoned Eleanor to his study, with a tone so deceptively calm that every instinct inside her screamed in warning. She stepped inside quietly, hands folded, posture composed, though fear tightened her ribs with each breath. Cedric sat behind his desk, fingers drumming lightly against an unopened decanter. He did not greet her. He simply lifted his gaze and let the silence stretch until it became a threat in itself. At last he spoke, his voice a soft blade. "Tell me," he murmured, leaning back in his chair, "have you enjoyed the Duke's attention?" Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "I do not understand," she said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. Cedric rose slowly, circling her like a predator assessing a trembling fawn. "Do not insult me," he hissed. I am not blind. I saw him watching you. I heard the whispers. Do you imagine you're so charming that a duke would take interest for no reason? His accusation struck her like a blow. She forced herself to breathe evenly. Your Grace, I have never sought his attention. I barely know him. Cedric stopped abruptly, his hand gripping her chin with bruising force, forcing her to look up into eyes glittering with a fury barely held in check. Liar, he breathed. You want to humiliate me. You want to parade yourself like some innocent flower desperate to be plucked by a better man. Eleanor's pulse thundered. She kept her voice as steady as possible. I have done nothing to shame you. Cedric's laughter rang sharp and hollow. You shame me simply by breathing the same air as him. Do you think I don't see how he looks at you? Do you think I won't tear out the roots of that interest before it grows? He released her suddenly, turning away with a snarl. You are my wife, mine, and I will not have you meddle with men who think themselves superior. Eleanor stood frozen, her skin throbbing where his fingers had dug into her. Terror and defiance warred within her chest, each breath a battle not to collapse. Miles away, in his solitary study, Adrian Blackthorne stood before the window, staring into the winter night with a heaviness he could no longer ignore. Word had reached him that Cedric was spiraling, his temper worsening, his paranoia sharpening into something dangerous. Adrian felt it in his bones, a storm gathering, violent and inevitable, and though he did not yet know how, he sensed the moment approaching when he would have no choice but to intervene, no matter the cost or scandal it would bring. The study door closed behind Eleanor with a quiet click that felt far louder than any slammed fist, sealing her inside the room with Cedric's simmering rage. He stood near the hearth, the flames casting jagged shadows across his face, transforming his features into something sharp and predatory. Eleanor remained near the door, unwilling to step further into the room, though she knew hesitation alone could ignite his temper. Cedric watched her with a stillness that made the back of her neck prickle. You've grown careless, he murmured, his voice a low vibration of restrained fury. If I must hear one more whisper about you attracting attention where it does not belong, I will ensure the consequences are unforgettable. His tone was soft, but it coiled around her like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. Eleanor clasped her hands together, keeping her voice steady. I have done nothing inappropriate. I speak only when spoken to. I behave as you expect. Cedric's laugh was cold, devoid of mirth. Your innocence bores me. It is not your actions I mistrust, it's your effect. He stepped closer, each measured stride tightening the air around her. I will not be mocked by London's aristocracy because my wife inspires pity or fascination. The word curved into a snarl, and Eleanor understood instantly. This was not about jealousy, it was about power. Cedric's pride had been wounded, and he intended to make her bleed for it. He reached her in 2 strides, his hand gripping her forearm with bruising force, pulling her closer until she could smell the bitter tang of wine on his breath. Listen carefully, he whispered, each syllable a blade pressed against her skin. If you speak to the Duke again, if you look at him, acknowledge him, or allow him to so much as breathe in your direction, I will destroy everything you love. Your father's fragile estate, your mother's health, your brother's future. I will burn your family to ash and scatter the remains until no one remembers the name Hargrave. Eleanor's breath caught, terror slicing through her. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened cruelly, forcing her still. You will behave, he continued, because their survival now depends on your obedience. And what a beautiful irony that is. When he finally released her, she stumbled back, clutching her aching arm. Cedric smoothed his sleeve as though nothing had happened, then added casually, I expect a quiet week. No social calls. No unexpected appearances. You will remain at home unless I request otherwise. He dismissed her with a flick of his hand, turning back to the hearth as if she were a trivial nuisance. As she slipped out of the room, her legs trembling, she felt the walls closing in, each corridor narrowing until the entire manor felt like a cage built precisely to stifle breath. Across the countryside, in his candlelit study, Adrian Blackthorne paused over a report from one of his informants. The details were vague, but troubling enough to twist something deep inside him. Eleanor's silence had become too complete, too unnatural. It was the kind of silence born from fear, and Adrian felt a cold certainty take root in his chest. Cedric Vale had crossed yet another invisible line, and the time for restraint was rapidly evaporating. Adrian Blackthorne had built his reputation on logic, discipline, and the refusal to act on emotion. Yet, as he sat in his study late into the night, surrounded by scattered reports and half-burned candles, he felt something dangerously close to anger, tightening through every controlled breath he took. The papers before him were not mere rumors but fragments of truth, collected by the discreet network he had assembled over the years, men whose loyalty was earned, not bought. Each whisper documented Cedric Vale's dealings with an unsettling clarity. Gambling dens hidden behind taverns, debts enforced through intimidation, violent altercations disguised as business disputes. Adrian reviewed the information with a sharp eye, noting patterns, connections, and particularly the names of men known for their brutality. This was no longer the whispered misconduct of a reckless aristocrat. Cedric's corruption ran deep, woven into corners of London that respectable men pretended did not exist. And Eleanor lived under the roof of the man, orchestrating it all. The thought struck Adrian with a force he could not ignore. He leaned back in his chair, pressing a hand against his brow, as if the gesture might steady the rising storm within him. He remembered the bruise on her wrist, the silence in her voice, the way she had trembled in the garden without allowing herself to collapse. And now, matched with the evidence before him, the truth sharpened into a single, undeniable reality. She was not merely unhappy, she was in danger. Halston, seated across from him, exhaled a slow breath as he placed another packet of documents on the desk. "Cedric is spiraling," he said quietly. "Too many debts, too many enemies, too many vices. Men like him do not break quietly, they explode." Adrian's jaw clenched. "Then Eleanor is standing beside a lit fuse," he replied, his voice low, carrying the weight of a promise he was not yet ready to speak aloud. Halston studied him for a moment. "You care for her?" Adrian's hand stilled, hovering above the papers. He did not answer. He did not need to. The silence spoke for him, thick with truths he refused to acknowledge. Halston continued cautiously. "If you become involved, this will escalate beyond social scandal. Cedric will not hesitate to strike where it hurts most." Adrian's dark gaze lifted, sharp and unyielding. "Then let him strike," he murmured. "I will be ready." For the first time in years, emotion cracked through his composed exterior, not recklessness, but purpose, fierce and cold. He gathered the documents into a single stack, sealing them within a leather-bound folder with a decisive snap. "Begin preparing the next phase," he instructed, quietly. "I want a full profile of Cedric's debts, his partners, and every man who would testify against him if given protection." Halston nodded, rising with a knowing look. "This path leads to war," he warned softly. Adrian met his gaze without flinching. "Then I will fight it," he answered. And as the door closed behind Halston, Adrian allowed himself one final thought, whispered only in the silence. Eleanor Hargrave would not be left to suffer alone, not while he still drew breath. Eleanor had learned to move through Ashcombe Manor like a shadow, quiet, observant, and unnoticed, but on the night Cedric left for what he called a business matter, something inside her shifted with a clarity she had not felt in months. She stood at the top of the staircase, watching him disappear into the darkness beyond the front doors, and felt the faintest flicker of possibility breathe against her skin. Cedric's temper had grown so violent, so erratic, that fear no longer paralyzed her, it galvanized her. If she wanted to survive, she could no longer rely on composure alone. She needed knowledge. She needed leverage. She needed to stop being the helpless creature Cedric believed he controlled. With trembling hands but steady resolve, she descended the steps and walked toward the one place Cedric guarded most fiercely, his study. The door, as if sensing her intent, seemed to loom larger tonight. She paused, listening to the stillness of the manor, then turned the knob slowly. The room felt colder without Cedric's presence, though the scent of his tobacco lingered like a warning. Eleanor lit a single candle, shielding its flame with her hand, and moved toward the desk. She no longer skimmed the surface of his papers as she once had. Now she examined each document with deliberate care. Ledgers filled with unfamiliar symbols, sealed letters marked with coded initials, lists of names crossed out with violent slashes. Each piece fed the forming picture of a world Cedric had built on intimidation and crime. Her heart pounded, but not solely from fear. As she bent over the desk, copying key details onto small scraps of paper she could conceal beneath her clothing, she felt her mind sharpen in ways she had not expected. For the first time since her marriage, she was not merely reacting to Cedric's cruelty, she was acting against it. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and Eleanor extinguished the candle in a rush of panic, pressing herself against the bookshelf as footsteps approached. Her breath hitched, and she prayed for the darkness to swallow her whole. But the footsteps passed, wandering toward the servants' quarters. She waited a long, trembling moment before relighting the candle and swiftly gathering the documents she needed, slipping the folded scraps into the lining of her corset, where Cedric would never think to look. When she stepped back from the desk, she caught her reflection in the darkened window, pale, exhausted, but with a glint of determination she barely recognized. This was not the same frightened bride who had walked down the aisle weeks ago. This woman was learning, adapting, surviving. As she returned to her room, her fingers brushed the hidden notes, small and fragile yet carrying the weight of her emerging courage. She did not know that miles away, Adrian Blackthorne sat with his own collection of evidence, analyzing Cedric's corruption with a fervor that mirrored her own. Unseen and unspoken, their separate paths were bending toward one another, each step driven by purpose and fear, and the quiet hope that escape might still be possible. And though she did not yet feel safe, Eleanor felt something almost as powerful stirring within her, her first faint taste of hope. The night after Eleanor gathered Cedric's documents, she lay awake beneath the canopy of her bed, her thoughts spinning like restless birds trapped in a gilded cage. She had information, dangerous, precious, and terrifying, but no means to use it. Cedric watched her more closely than ever, leaving her no opportunity to slip into town or send a letter without scrutiny. Yet hope, once awakened, refused to be smothered. As she stared into the darkness, she remembered the single maid whose kindness had not yet been crushed by the atmosphere of fear. Mary, a young woman with gentle eyes, who had always moved around Eleanor with quiet sympathy. The idea flickered in Eleanor's mind, like a fragile flame. If anyone could be trusted, it was Mary. The next morning, Eleanor found her chance when Cedric left abruptly for an unexpected meeting. She called Mary to her room under the pretense of needing assistance with her wardrobe. When the girl entered, Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken. "Mary," she whispered, closing the door with trembling hands, "I need your help, and I fear what I ask may put you at risk." Mary hesitated only a moment before nodding, her expression solemn. Eleanor retrieved a small folded note she had written in the early hours of dawn. The message was coded, layered with careful phrasing that would seem harmless to anyone but the intended recipient. Adrian Blackthorne. "Can you deliver this to Ravensford Hall?" Eleanor asked softly. "Discreetly. No one must know." Mary's breath caught in her throat. "My lady, if the Earl discovers—" "I know," Eleanor murmured, "but my life depends on this." The girl swallowed, then tucked the note into her apron with a courage Eleanor had not expected. "I will take it tonight," Mary whispered, and in that moment Eleanor felt a fragile strand of hope pull taut between them. Hours later, as dusk crept across the land, Adrian sat in his study sorting through reports when Mary was shown in by one of his trusted staff. She looked frightened but determined as she handed him the folded paper. Adrian broke the seal with steady fingers, his breath catching the moment he recognized Eleanor's handwriting. Her message was brief and cautious, but every word trembled with desperation. She spoke of growing danger, of Cedric's unraveling mind, of information she now possessed, information that could destroy him. She ended with a simple, haunting line: "I do not know how much longer I can protect myself." Adrian closed the note, a storm gathering behind his eyes. He wrote a reply at once, equally careful, promising action and urging her to hold on. Mary departed with the letter hidden against her skin, slipping back into the night like a courier of salvation. When Eleanor received Adrian's response, she felt her knees weaken with relief. For the first time in months, she did not feel entirely alone. Yet even as hope warmed her chest, a shiver ran down her spine. Each letter exchange tightened the noose of danger, and if Cedric ever discovered their correspondence, the consequences would be catastrophic. Still, Eleanor clutched Adrian's words to her heart, knowing this secret connection was now her lifeline. The storm arrived without warning. Cedric burst through the manor doors near midnight, his coat soaked from rain and his eyes blazing with a ferocity that made the servants scatter like startled birds. Eleanor had been sitting in the drawing room, clutching Adrian's letter within her sleeve as if its presence alone could steady her breath. The moment she heard Cedric's footsteps, heavy, uneven, seething, her body tensed instinctively. She rose from the settee, smoothing her skirts to hide the trembling in her hands, but nothing could disguise the fear curling cold beneath her ribs. Cedric entered the room with a fury so palpable that the candles flickered in his wake. His jaw clenched, his fists already bruised, and his coat smelled faintly of smoke and sweat, as though violence had clung to him long before he stepped inside. Eleanor opened her mouth to ask if he was well, but the words died when he turned toward her with an expression she recognized too well, rage searching for a target. He strode toward the nearest servant, a young man carrying a tray, and without hesitation struck him across the face with the back of his hand. The tray crashed to the floor, silver scattering in a chaotic ring of sound that echoed too loudly through the room. The servant fell hard, dazed and bleeding from a fresh cut along his cheek. Eleanor gasped, rushing forward before fear could stop her, but Cedric blocked her path with a single threatening step. "Do not move," he growled, his voice thick with liquor and contempt. "This worthless fool ruined a business arrangement I have spent months cultivating." The servant trembled, apologizing through bloodied lips, yet Cedric's fury only escalated. He kicked the young man with brutal force, sending him tumbling to the side as the other servants looked on in paralyzed horror. Eleanor could feel her pulse pounding against her throat. She wanted to scream, to shield the fallen man, to beg Cedric for mercy, but any protest would only redirect his rage toward her. At last, Cedric tired of the assault. He wiped his knuckles against his coat, breathing heavily, and barked orders for the servants to carry the injured man away. They obeyed swiftly, disappearing into the corridor with fearful glances cast back at Eleanor. When Cedric finally looked at her, she saw something darker than anger, something unhinged, something unraveling. "Do you see?" he spat, gesturing wildly. "Do you see what betrayal costs? Weakness invites punishment, disobedience invites ruin." Eleanor stood frozen, every muscle locked in place as his words twisted through her mind like barbed wire. She knew he wasn't speaking only of the servant. He was speaking to her, about her, and the threat beneath the surface chilled her to the bone. Hours later, long after Cedric had retreated to his chambers in a stupor, Eleanor remained awake, staring at the dying embers in the hearth. Cedric's violence had crossed a threshold she could no longer ignore. The walls of Ashcombe Manor seemed to vibrate with danger, and miles away, Adrian Blackthorne received a late-night message confirming Cedric's assault, a report that ignited a cold, decisive fury in his veins. Cedric Vale was losing control, and Adrian knew, with a certainty that tightened every breath, that Eleanor's life was nearing a breaking point. Adrian Blackthorne had always considered himself a man governed by principles rather than impulses. Yet as he stood in the dimly lit war room of Ravensford Hall with maps, documents, and sealed letters spread before him, he felt the first stirrings of something far stronger than duty. It was not merely anger at Cedric's cruelty, nor the disgust that had sharpened each time new evidence of the Earl's crimes reached his desk. It was the image of Eleanor, fragile yet resilient, terrified yet unbroken, that had finally shattered the restraint he had spent years cultivating. He could no longer pretend involvement was a matter of conscience alone. Her suffering had carved itself into him, each new bruise described in whispers, each tremor in her handwritten notes like a plea echoing through his chest. And so, with a resolve colder and sharper than steel, he summoned his most trusted allies for a private meeting far from prying ears. The room filled slowly, one confidant after another arriving with solemn expressions, none daring to question the urgency that emanated from the Duke. Lord Halston took his place beside Adrian, laying a fresh bundle of reports across the table. Captain Doyle, a man loyal to the Blackthorne family for decades, stood with arms crossed, jaw tight. Several others joined, men skilled in diplomacy, investigation, and, when necessary, conflict. When the last door closed, Adrian spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had already made his decision. "Cedric Vale is a threat," he began, voice low but unwavering, "not only to the stability of our society, but to a woman who has endured far more than any ought to bear. The time for restraint is over." His allies exchanged heavy glances. They had suspected as much, but to hear the Duke speak so plainly signaled the gravity of what lay ahead. Halston unrolled a map of Cedric's known properties, pointing to the gambling dens, the hidden warehouses, the taverns functioning as fronts for illicit activities. "His debts are climbing," Halston explained. "He is desperate. That makes him reckless and dangerous." Adrian nodded, his gaze chilling as he traced the lines on the map. "Then we dismantle everything he has built, piece by piece, quietly, efficiently, without giving him the chance to retaliate. Captain Doyle stepped forward. "And the Countess?" he asked. "If Cedric is cornered, she will be the first target." A shadow passed through Adrian's expression. "Which is why she must be protected at all costs," he replied. "Gather a team prepared to intervene if necessary. She will not be left alone again." As plans unfolded, covert surveillance, financial traps, strategic pressures designed to collapse Cedric's operations, Adrian felt the storm inside him harden into purpose. He knew the risks. He knew the scandal would be immense if word reached society. But none of it mattered compared to the truth burning in him. He would not let Eleanor be swallowed by Cedric's darkness. Not while he still drew breath. When the meeting ended, Adrian stood alone, staring into the flickering fire. The room was quiet, but his decision echoed loudly in the stillness. War had begun, not with swords, but with strategy, resolve, and an unwavering vow to protect the woman whose fate had entwined itself with his own. Eleanor felt the shift in Cedric long before she understood what form it would take. There was a brittle quality to his silence that morning, a crackling tension beneath every movement he made as he stalked through the manor with restless fury simmering beneath his polished exterior. She moved carefully, sensing danger with every breath, but it was not enough to shield her when the storm finally broke. She was in her chamber, fastening the clasp of the small locket her mother had given her before passing, a tiny silver oval containing a faded portrait, one of the last pieces of tenderness her life still held. When Cedric appeared in the doorway without knocking, his eyes landed on the locket, and in an instant something venomous ignited within him. "Still clinging to that relic?" he sneered, stepping inside with the slow, deliberate gait of a man savoring cruelty. "You wear it as though it carries value." Eleanor froze, instinctively covering the pendant with her hand. "It was my mother's," she whispered. "It harms no one." Cedric laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "Everything about you harms someone," he replied. Before she could react, he reached forward with a sudden, violent motion, ripping the locket from her neck so forcefully that chains snapped and stung her skin. Eleanor gasped, reaching instinctively to reclaim it, but Cedric crushed the pendant beneath his heel with a deliberate, grinding pressure, the metal groaning before splitting into dented fragments scattered across the floor. Something in her shattered. She stared at the ruined locket, her breath catching, her vision blurring with a grief too sharp to contain. Cedric watched her with satisfaction gleaming in his eyes, as though her pain were a victory. "Perhaps now you'll remember where your loyalties should lie," he said coldly. "Your past belongs to me. Your future belongs to me. Everything you value, everything, is mine to destroy if I wish." Eleanor felt the familiar terror rising inside her, but beneath it, something new took shape. It was not rage, that would have been too loud, but a quiet, steady breaking that revealed the steel beneath her fear. She lifted her gaze slowly, and though her voice trembled, it did not collapse. "You may destroy what I carry," she whispered, "but you will never own what I am." Cedric froze, shock flickering across his features before fury drowned it out. He stepped forward, hand raised as if to strike, but Eleanor did not flinch. Her stillness unnerved him. He lowered his hand with a snarl, turning sharply and leaving the room as though chased by something he could not control. When the door slammed behind him, Eleanor knelt shakily to gather the broken pieces of the locket, holding them in her palms like fragments of a former life. Tears blurred her vision, but beneath the sorrow was a clarity she had never felt before. Cedric had taken nearly everything from her, but not her will, not her strength, not her resolve to survive. And miles away, Adrian Blackthorne felt a chill coursing through him, as though Eleanor's breaking point had sent a silent cry across the distance between them. The night Cedric rode away again, summoned by one of his increasingly frantic associates, Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching the last lantern of his carriage disappear into the fog. She did not move for several heartbeats, her fingers still curled around the broken remnants of her mother's locket, hidden in her pocket. That small weight anchored her, reminding her that she had reached the edge of what her spirit could endure. She knew Cedric's temper would only worsen as his world unraveled, and she felt with a painful certainty that the next storm he brought home might be aimed entirely at her. The quiet of the manor felt deceptive, a thin veil stretched over the dangers that lurked beneath. But tonight she would not waste the hollow stillness. Tonight she would seek the only lifeline she had left. She slipped into the dim corridor, her steps soft, measured, practiced. She passed the servants' quarters, looking for Mary, the maid whose loyalty had become the fragile thread connecting Eleanor to the outside world. Mary emerged from a doorway carrying linens, but her eyes widened with immediate understanding when she saw Eleanor's expression. "Is it time, my lady?" she whispered. Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding unevenly, not from fear alone but from the tremulous hope that this night might begin her salvation. Mary led her through the back passageways, their footsteps echoing against stone, until they reached the far edge of the gardens, where a small iron gate opened to the darkened woodland beyond. There, half shrouded by barren branches, stood Adrian Blackthorne. He stepped forward the moment he saw them, shadows falling away from his stern features. Eleanor felt her breath hitch, relief, fear, and something deeper converging in a rush. Adrian looked at her with a gaze so steady it seemed to hold the entire world still. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice low, controlled, yet threaded with concern he no longer bothered to hide. "Not physically," she whispered, though the words trembled with the truth of her unraveling. He exhaled a breath he had been holding for far too long, the tension in his shoulders easing by a fraction. "Then hear me now," he said softly. "We will not let him break you." Mary stepped back, keeping watch while Adrian outlined the plan in a hushed, precise tone. "My men will arrive tomorrow night. They'll come through the servants' path and take you to a carriage waiting at the edge of the woods. From there, you'll be escorted to Ravensford Hall. Quietly, safely. Cedric will not know until you are far beyond his reach." Eleanor felt the magnitude of his words settle around her like a fragile shield. "If this fails," she murmured, "Cedric will destroy anyone who helped me." Adrian's expression hardened, a cold fire awakening in his eyes. "It will not fail," he vowed. "I have prepared for every possibility." As Eleanor returned to the manor through the shadows, her heart raced with fear, but for the first time in months, it raced with hope as well. Tomorrow would be her chance to escape. Tomorrow she would choose her own fate. Night fell over Ashcombe Manor like a heavy curtain, smothering the world in a dense shroud of fog and moonless dark. Eleanor stood in her chamber listening to the distant ticking of the ornate clock on the mantel, each second stretching so tightly it felt ready to snap. Mary had prepared everything, a cloak hidden beneath the bed, a small satchel of essentials tucked discreetly near the window, and a route through the servants' corridor that offered the best chance of remaining unseen. But knowing the plan did little to calm the tremor running through Eleanor's veins. She was leaving tonight. She was stepping into uncertainty with nothing but hope as her compass. And if she hesitated, even for a breath, Cedric would destroy any chance of freedom she had clawed from the shadows. When the clock struck midnight, its chime muffled by the storm outside, Eleanor pulled her cloak around her shoulders and slipped into the hallway. The stillness of the manor felt unnatural, as though the walls themselves held their breath. She moved with careful precision, gliding along the familiar route Mary had shown her earlier, but every step carried the weight of danger. Every flicker of candlelight cast a shadow capable of betraying her. She reached the servants' staircase, heart racing, and began her descent, only to freeze when she heard a faint, unmistakable sound behind her. A door creaking open. Footsteps, heavy, slow. Cedric. Eleanor's breath caught, her blood turning to ice. She pressed herself against the wall, praying the darkness would swallow her. But Cedric's voice sliced through the silence, thick with suspicion and fury. "Eleanor." Her heart plummeted. She turned slowly, seeing his silhouette at the top of the stairs, his posture rigid, his breath uneven. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. She did not answer, could not answer, because her throat had closed around her fear. Cedric took a step downward, then another, rage building with each movement. Eleanor gathered her skirts, instincts taking control, and fled. She darted down the stairs, her footsteps echoing like gunshots. Cedric roared her name, his boots striking the steps with murderous intent as he chased her through the narrow corridor. Eleanor ran faster than she had ever run in her life, desperation propelling her forward. When she rounded the final corner toward the servants' entrance, a strong arm swept around her waist, not Cedric's, but one of Adrian's guards. "This way, my lady," he whispered urgently, pulling her into a concealed passage hidden behind a tapestry. Cedric's footsteps thundered past the doorway moments later, his curses twisting through the air with feral rage. The guards led Eleanor through the hidden passage and out into the cold night where a carriage waited beneath the skeletal branches of the old oak. And there, standing beside it with breath tight and eyes burning, was Adrian Blackthorne. The moment she saw him, the terror inside her dissolved into a trembling relief that made her knees weaken. He reached for her hand, steadying her as she climbed into the carriage. "You're safe now," he murmured, though his voice trembled with the aftershock of nearly losing her. As the carriage surged forward into the fog, Eleanor looked back one last time. Cedric stood on the manor steps, a dark silhouette radiating pure vengeance, and she understood with chilling certainty that tonight was only the beginning. Eleanor awoke to the soft glow of morning streaming through heavy velvet drapes, the light diffused by the frost-tinged glass of an unfamiliar window. For a long, disoriented moment she lay still, her breath shallow, her mind caught between fear and disbelief. She was not in Ashcombe Manor. She was not listening for Cedric's footsteps or bracing for the next command that would tear another piece of her spirit away. Instead, she felt warmth, the steady crackle of a fire burning low in the hearth, the faint scent of lavender drifting from freshly laundered linens, and the distant hush of Ravensford Hall stirring with quiet morning life. When she finally pushed herself upright, the realization washed over her in a trembling wave. She was safe. The door creaked softly, and Adrian Blackthorne entered with cautious steps, as though approaching something delicate, something breakable. He carried no title in his expression now, no icy reserve or aristocratic armor, only profound relief that softened the sharp lines of his face. "You're awake," he murmured, his voice low, steady, and so gentle it nearly unraveled her. Eleanor nodded, her fingers curling into the blanket as though anchoring herself in reality. "I thought I was dreaming," she whispered, "or that Cedric would appear at any moment." Adrian's jaw tightened with a flash of anger he did not bother to restrain. "He will not touch you again, not while you are under my protection." His hand hovered near hers for a breath, then withdrew when he sensed her hesitation. He was careful, deliberate in every movement, as though determined not to overwhelm her. Eleanor lowered her gaze, emotions swirling chaotically inside her chest. Gratitude, fear, disbelief, and a fragile thread of hope pulled her in opposite directions. "There will be consequences," she said softly. "For you, for anyone who helped me escape." Adrian stepped closer, allowing the sunlight to catch in his dark eyes. "The consequences belong to me," he replied. "Your safety is not a burden I regret." She swallowed hard, her throat tight. No one had spoken to her like that in months, perhaps ever. His words felt like an unguarded truth, heavy and warm. After ensuring she was steady enough to rise, Adrian guided her through the quiet corridors of Ravensford Hall. The estate felt different from Ashcombe Manor, alive, warm, and untainted by dread. Servants moved with sincerity rather than fear, offering respectful nods and gentle smiles that made Eleanor's heart ache. She reached the conservatory, where sunlight spilled through the glass ceiling like poured gold. Adrian paused beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are free here, Eleanor. You may walk where you wish, speak when you choose, breathe without fear." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. Freedom felt overwhelming, fragile, almost unreal. But beneath her relief lay a shadow, the knowledge that Cedric would not accept her escape. She sensed it in the tightening of Adrian's shoulders, in the way his eyes scanned the horizon with vigilant calculation. Sanctuary was not the end. It was the beginning of a war Cedric would not hesitate to wage. And yet, for the first time, Eleanor felt she had a chance to fight back. By the third day of Eleanor's refuge at Ravensford Hall, London society had already transformed her disappearance into a spectacle of whispered speculation and polished gossip. Parlours buzzed with rumours that shifted from pity to scandal with every retelling. Some claimed she had eloped with a lover, others insisted Cedric had driven her into madness, and a few bolder tongues murmured that the Duke of Ravensford himself had stolen her away. Each version grew more embellished, until truth became a fragile thread nearly drowned beneath layers of embellishment. Eleanor knew nothing of these tales at first, but she sensed their existence in the clipped letters Adrian received and the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. She had spent so long being invisible that becoming the center of society's fixation felt disorienting, like stepping from darkness into a spotlight she never asked for. Still, the sanctuary of Ravensford Hall began to soften the edges of her fear. She walked through the sunlit corridors with tentative steps, marveling at the gentleness in the servants' eyes, at the warmth of the hearths, and the quiet peace that clung to every room. Here, no one flinched at Cedric's name, no one watched her with suspicion. Yet freedom felt foreign, almost too generous to trust. More than once, She found herself glancing over her shoulder, expecting Cedric's shadow to spill across the tiles. The trauma of months did not fade simply because she had escaped its source. Adrian noticed each small tremor with a restraint that surprised even him. He kept his distance in a way that protected her rather than isolated her, speaking with her only when she sought his presence. And she did seek it, slowly, quietly, like a flower turning toward warmth without realizing it. One afternoon, she found him in the library reading correspondence from influential allies. His expression was grim as he set aside a letter. "Society is divided," he said, choosing his words with care. "Some believe you fled from cruelty, others believe you fled into impropriety. Your absence from Ashcombe Manor has become fuel for the gossips." Eleanor sank into the chair opposite him, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I did not wish for anyone to see this," she whispered. "Not like this. I only wanted safety." Adrian softened, leaning forward slightly. "You have it, and I will shoulder whatever blame they attempt to place upon you." His certainty steadied her more than she expected. "Why would you endure scandal for my sake?" she asked quietly, vulnerable in the question. Adrian held her gaze, his voice low. "Because your suffering should never have been a topic of speculation. And because—" He stopped himself, the unspoken words hanging between them like fragile glass. Eleanor's heart fluttered with a confusing mixture of gratitude and something warmer. She rose, offering him a soft, tremulous smile before retreating to the corridor, leaving the question suspended between them. Outside, winter wind brushed against the tall windows, carrying whispers from London to Ravensford Hall. But this time, Eleanor felt something different stirring within her, something stronger than shame, more resilient than fear. For the first time, she dared to believe she was more than the scandal others tried to paint her as. Cedric Vale did not grieve Eleanor's departure. He raged. The moment he discovered her absence, the manor trembled beneath the force of his fury. Servants were struck, furniture shattered, and threats rippled from his lips like venom seeking a place to strike. But beneath the chaos simmered something more dangerous than rage, wounded pride. His wife escaping him was an offense he could not tolerate, a humiliation he vowed to erase by any means necessary. And so, days after her flight, he marched into the magistrate's office with documents in hand and accusations sharpened like blades. He claimed abduction, coercion, manipulation, painting Adrian Blackthorne as a villain who had stolen a fragile, impressionable wife from her husband's rightful care. Cedric's voice dripped with feigned sorrow, his expression an expertly crafted mask of a betrayed man seeking justice. The magistrates listened, uneasy but unable to dismiss a peer of the realm without investigation. Cedric left the office with a satisfied sneer, believing he had set a trap that would tarnish Adrian's name and force Eleanor back into his grasp. When word of Cedric's charges reached Ravensford Hall, Adrian read the written accusations with an icy calm that barely concealed the tempest within him. Eleanor sat across from him in the study, hands trembling around the teacup she struggled to hold steady. "He means to ruin you," she whispered, guilt tightening around her throat. "Because of me." Adrian set the papers aside and moved closer, lowering himself into the seat beside her with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "No," he said firmly. "He means to ruin himself with this desperation. The truth stands on our side." But Eleanor shook her head, overwhelmed by the thought that her escape had placed a respected duke in the crosshairs of scandal. "He will not stop, Adrian. Cedric doesn't care about truth. He cares about winning, about control." Her voice faltered, thick with fear. "I do not want you hurt in this." Adrian reached out, stopping just short of taking her hand, allowing her the choice to close the distance. When she did, her fingers trembling into his palm, it felt like a vow passing between them. "Listen to me," he said softly. "I entered this conflict willingly. Your safety is not a burden, and Cedric's cruelty will not go unanswered." Eleanor's breath shook, a mixture of relief and terror twisting inside her. She knew he spoke the truth, yet she could not quiet the dread that Cedric's retaliation had only begun. That night, another blow arrived: Cedric's letters to her family. Eleanor's mother wrote in frantic distress, warning that Cedric had demanded their public condemnation of her actions. Her father, frail and indebted, feared that refusal would bring ruin. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she read the shaking script. Adrian took the letter gently from her hands. "I will protect them too," he vowed. "He will not touch your family." His words were steady, promises anchored in conviction, not comfort. Outside, the winter wind howled against Ravensford Hall, but inside, another storm was gathering, one Cedric had ignited, and Adrian was fully prepared to face. The day Eleanor took the stand dawned grey and brittle, as though the sky itself braced for the weight of what she was about to unveil. Ravensford Hall had prepared her as best they could, Mary buttoning her gown with trembling care, Adrian offering steady assurances with the quiet intensity of a man who understood the cost of courage, but nothing eased the pressure tightening around Eleanor's ribs as she stepped into the magistrate's hall. The chamber buzzed with barely restrained curiosity. Nobles, officials, and onlookers crowded the benches, their eyes sharp with hunger for scandal or justice, whichever offered the greater thrill. Eleanor walked forward with her chin lifted, though every step felt like crossing shards of glass. Cedric sat near the front, posture crisp, expression twisted into a mask of virtuous indignation that repulsed her. His gaze slid over her with chilling smugness, as if he expected her to crumble the moment she opened her mouth. When the magistrate asked her to swear honesty, Eleanor's voice trembled but did not break, and then, with the room holding its breath, she began. She spoke not of every wound, some hurts were too deep for public display, but of the truth that had shaped her nights and hollowed her days. She described the controlling rules Cedric forced upon her, the punishments disguised as discipline, the violent episodes that spilled into the lives of servants too afraid to testify. She told them of the destroyed locket, her mother's last gift crushed beneath Cedric's heel, as though her memories held no worth. With each word she spoke, the tremor in her voice steadied, and her shoulders drew back with new resolve. She had lived these horrors in silence, but now the silence cracked open, spilling truth into every corner of the hall. Cedric attempted to interrupt, slamming his hand on the table and demanding she be reprimanded for fabrications born of feminine hysteria, but the magistrate silenced him sharply. Still, he glared at Eleanor with such venom that even the air seemed to sharpen around him. "Lies," he hissed when allowed to speak. "My wife is weak, impressionable, manipulated by the Duke, who seeks to tarnish a rival." He gestured toward Adrian with a theatrical flourish meant to turn public sentiment against them both. But when asked about his own conduct, the injured servant, the gambling debts, the coded ledgers, Cedric stumbled, offering explanations that unraveled under scrutiny. His arrogance, once so polished, now cracked at the edges as the magistrates exchanged knowing glances. Through it all, Adrian remained in the audience, his gaze never leaving Eleanor. Pride, fury, and something far deeper flickered across his eyes as he watched her speak her truth with trembling strength. Eleanor felt that silent presence holding her up when her knees threatened to give beneath her. By the time she stepped down, her body felt hollowed by exhaustion, yet lighter than it had in years. As she returned to her seat, she did not look at Cedric again. She didn't need to. The shift in the room told her everything. The tide had finally begun to turn. The magistrate's decision arrived sooner than anyone expected, carried on a chill wind that swept through London with the quiet force of inevitability. Eleanor sat beside Adrian in one of the private antechambers of the hall, her hands clasped tightly together as the door opened, and the chief magistrate entered with an expression carved from solemn resolution. He announced that Cedric Vale was to be arrested on charges of violent misconduct, financial corruption, and unlawful intimidation, his words falling with the weight of justice long delayed. Eleanor felt her breath catch, not in triumph, but in a profound stillness that wrapped around her heart like fragile ice beginning to thaw. She listened in silence as Adrian thanked the magistrate with measured dignity, though the tension in his jaw revealed the storm of emotions he held tightly contained. When the official withdrew, the room fell into a hush, broken only by Eleanor's unsteady exhale. "It is over," Adrian murmured, his voice softened with relief. But Eleanor shook her head faintly. "Not yet," she whispered. "I will not believe it until I see him fall." Her wish was granted that very afternoon, when Cedric's arrest became the spectacle London had not known it craved. Word travelled swiftly. By the time the constables reached Ashcombe Manor, a small crowd had gathered at the gates, drawn by equal parts morbid curiosity and vindictive delight. Cedric appeared on the manor steps in a fury, shouting accusations, denials, and threats that sounded increasingly unhinged. His once immaculate coat hung askew, his cravat undone, his composure shattered into jagged pieces. As the constables seized him, he fought like a cornered animal, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Do you know who I am?" he roared. "This is beneath me. She lies. They all lie. But even as he struggled, something in the crowd shifted. The murmurs of support he might have once commanded were replaced by derision, disgust, and a quiet, collective satisfaction that the veil of nobility no longer protected him. Eleanor did not witness the scene firsthand, but she felt it ripple through Ravensford Hall like a change in air pressure. When Adrian returned from speaking with the magistrates, his expression told her everything before he uttered a single word. "It is done," he said gently. "Cedric is in custody awaiting trial, and the evidence against him is overwhelming." Eleanor's knees weakened, and she sank onto a nearby settee, tears gathering but not falling. The relief was immense, yet tangled with disbelief, sorrow, and a grief she did not truly understand. Adrian knelt beside her, his presence steady, his voice low. "You are free now. Whatever comes next, it will not involve him." She nodded slowly, feeling the truth settle inside her like a delicate, unbroken light. For the first time in months, the shadows that clung to her began to recede. And though she knew healing would come in waves, uneven and unpredictable, she felt the faint flutter of something she had not allowed herself in a very long time, the beginning of peace. Ravensford Hall glowed in the warm hush of dusk, its tall windows catching the last amber traces of sunlight, as if the sky itself wished to linger a little longer over its quiet sanctuary. Eleanor stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, wrapped in a shawl Mary had draped around her shoulders, her breath a soft mist in the cool evening air. The lavender bushes swayed gently, their fragrance weaving through the breeze like a soothing whisper. For the first time since her escape, she allowed herself to breathe without counting the seconds between each inhale, without listening for footsteps behind her. Yet peace, she discovered, brought its own kind of trembling. With Cedric gone, the walls she had built to survive no longer held purpose, and with their collapse came the raw, overwhelming truth of her own emotions. Fear, exhaustion, gratitude, and beneath it all, a quietly burgeoning warmth she had fought so long to ignore. She heard Adrian before she saw him, the soft sound of his footsteps on the stone walkway, carrying a familiarity that eased something deep inside her. When he joined her at the rail, he did not speak at once. Instead, he stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed on the distant horizon painted in hues of fading gold. Silence stretched between them, not heavy but fragile, intimate in its simplicity. At last Adrian turned slightly, his eyes searching her expression with a tenderness he could no longer conceal. "How are you faring?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already sensed the answer. Eleanor drew the shawl closer, her fingers brushing against the fringe. "I am learning how to be unafraid," she said softly. "It feels like learning to walk again." Adrian exhaled, a quiet, aching sound that tugged at her heart. "You have been braver than anyone had the right to ask of you." Eleanor looked down, struggling to steady her breath. "I was only surviving," she murmured. "Survival is not courage." Adrian stepped closer, the shift in distance subtle but undeniably significant. "Eleanor," he said gently, "survival is courage. You endured what would have broken many. And still, you stand." His voice carried sincerity so deep it shook her. When she lifted her gaze to his, the last of the sunset caught in his eyes, revealing the emotion he had tried too long to restrain. A breeze drifted across the terrace, brushing a curl across her cheek. Adrian reached out, stopping just short of touching her, giving her time to step away if she wished. She did not. His fingers brushed her cheek with the reverence of a man touching something precious, something irrevocably fragile. "I vowed to protect you," he whispered, long before I allowed myself to understand why. Eleanor's breath hitched, her heart thundering with a mixture of fear and longing. "And why?" she managed, the word trembling between them like a held breath. Adrian swallowed, emotion tightening his voice. "Because somewhere between watching you suffer and watching you survive, I began to care for you more than I should." The confession hung in the fading light, delicate and dangerous. Eleanor felt her world tilt, not with fear, but with possibility. Eleanor stood frozen beneath the deepening twilight, her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird as Adrian's confession lingered between them, fragile as spun glass yet heavy with revelation. She had imagined many endings to her suffering, escape, solitude, perhaps even a quiet death. But she had never imagined standing on a terrace bathed in dusk, hearing the most powerful man she knew admit feelings he had tried so fiercely to bury. The warmth that unfurled in her chest frightened her almost as much as it soothed. After so many months of fear, tenderness felt unfamiliar, almost illicit, and yet she found herself drawn to it with a yearning she had not allowed herself to feel in years. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice faltered under the weight of emotion pressing against her throat. Adrian watched her with a gaze so gentle it ached. His usual reserve softened into something unguarded, almost vulnerable. "You owe me no answer," he murmured, stepping back just enough to give her breath, not distance. "I would never ask you to return what you do not feel. I only wished you to know the truth." His restraint, his consideration, the very opposite of ownership, struck Eleanor deeper than any declaration could. She wrapped her arms around herself, the shawl pulling tight, grounding her as thoughts spun in trembling circles. "I do not know what I feel," she whispered. "I have spent so long forcing my heart into silence that I scarcely recognize its voice." Adrian nodded slowly, understanding flickering across his expression like the glow of a lantern in the dark. "Your freedom came at great cost. Your heart deserves time to heal before it is asked to decide its path." His words eased something inside her, a knot of dread unwinding into fragile threads of hope. She looked at him with gratitude shining through her uncertainty. "But when you speak to me, when you look at me," her breath wavered. "I feel as though something long dormant is waking." The admission left her trembling. Adrian's breath caught, and the faintest tremor passed across his composed facade, revealing how deeply her words struck him. Slowly, as though fearful of breaking the moment, he lifted a hand toward her cheek. This time she leaned into the touch, her skin warming beneath his fingertips. The world around them hushed, the wind gentling, the distant rustle of leaves fading, until only the sound of their breaths remained. "Eleanor," he whispered, her name slipping from his tongue like a prayer. "If I kiss you now, know that it is not for gratitude or rescue or obligation. It is only because I cannot bear the thought of another moment without showing you what you have begun to mean to me." Her heart thudded once, hard, like a door flung open, and then she whispered, "Then show me." Adrian closed the final inches between them, his lips brushing hers with a tentative reverence that stole the air from her lungs. The kiss was gentle, unhurried, an offering, not a claim. Eleanor felt her hands rise, trembling, to rest against his chest, and in that fragile moment under a darkening sky, she tasted something sweeter than freedom. She tasted the beginning of a life she had not dared to imagine. Cedric Vale had always believed himself untouchable, a man destined to bend the world to his will through force, manipulation, and inherited power. But as he sat within the cold confines of the magistrate's holding chamber, the reality of his fall settled around him like damp stone. His wrists bore the red marks of restraints he had fought savagely, his breath reeking of fury and desperation. Each passing hour gnawed at the frayed edges of his sanity. The guards avoided his gaze, not from respect but disgust, for Cedric had become something pitiful, an echo of the arrogant aristocrat who once towered over every room he entered. Yet even in chains, he clung to one obsession with a feverish grip. Eleanor. She had humiliated him, defied him, escaped him, and he could not rest until she was punished for daring to breathe without his permission. When his solicitor arrived, Cedric pounced like a starved wolf, demanding updates. The solicitor, a man weary and pale, explained in clipped tones that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses had come forward, ledgers had been uncovered, the magistrates were preparing a swift trial. Cedric's eyes burned with disbelief. "This is Adrian Blackthorne's doing," he snarled. "He has always envied me, always sought to undermine me. Now he hides behind my wife like a coward." His solicitor hesitated, then quietly corrected him. "Lady Eleanor is no longer considered your wife. The petition for annulment has been drafted and is likely to succeed, given the circumstances." Cedric froze. The air left his lungs in a violent rush. "Annulment," he echoed, his voice cracking with a raw, unhinged edge. "She is mine. She will always be mine." The solicitor took a cautious step back as Cedric's rage spiraled into something feral. "Your Grace," he said softly, "Eleanor Hargrave has presented testimony that carries immense weight. The magistrates believe her. Society believes her. You cannot reclaim her." Cedric let out a guttural laugh, one that scraped the walls like rusted metal. "I will reclaim her," he whispered, "even if I must tear Ravensford Hall apart stone by stone." That night, as the guards changed shifts, Cedric staged his moment of madness. He feigned collapse, groaning, clutching his chest, and when an inexperienced guard approached, Cedric struck with brutal precision. Moments later he vanished into the rain-soaked labyrinth of London streets, driven by a single, consuming thought. Eleanor belonged to him, and he would reclaim her or destroy everything she touched. Miles away at Ravensford Hall, the night unfolded in peaceful stillness. Eleanor sat by the fire in Adrian's study, wrapped in soft wool, her gaze drifting across shelves lined with books. She felt a fragile calm settling over her, still tender from the kiss they had shared the night before. Adrian entered, carrying correspondence, his eyes warming when they met hers. But his expression shifted when a messenger burst into the room, breathless, soaked from rain. "Your Grace," the messenger gasped. "Cedric Vale has escaped custody." The room fell silent. Eleanor's breath hitched. Adrian's jaw clenched as fury and dread coiled within him. Cedric was coming, and he would stop at nothing. The storm that gathered over Ravensford Hall that night seemed an omen, its winds rattling the shutters and its rain carving restless patterns across the windowpanes. Eleanor sat in the drawing-room beside a flickering fire, trying to steady her breath while servants rushed in quiet urgency through the hallways. Adrian had doubled the guard, stationing men at every entrance and sending riders to alert neighboring estates. Yet for Eleanor the air felt too thin, too brittle, as if the house itself feared the danger closing in. Cedric was out there, desperate, unpredictable, and driven by the twisted conviction that she still belonged to him. She clutched the shawl around her shoulders, hearing her heartbeat louder than the storm outside. Adrian entered the room with swift, purposeful steps, his coat damp from the rain where he had walked the perimeter himself to ensure their defenses were secure. His expression softened when he saw her, but tension etched the lines around his eyes. "Are you managing?" he asked gently. Eleanor nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "I am trying," she whispered. Adrian moved closer, lowering himself to sit beside her. "Listen to me," he said, voice low and steady. "Cedric may be ruthless, but he lacks strategy. He acts from fear, not reason. That gives us the advantage." She tried to absorb his calm, but fear gnawed at her heart. "What if he gets inside?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Adrian took her hand, folding it into his with a firmness that steadied her breath. "If he reaches this room, he will have to go through me." Before Eleanor could answer, a scream tore through the hall. Adrian was on his feet instantly. Eleanor rose behind him, heart hammering. Footsteps thundered across the marble corridor. One of the guards burst into the drawing-room, blood streaking his shoulder. "Your Grace, he's inside," the guard gasped. "He forced the east door. A gunshot cracked through the hallway, the sound splintering the night. The guard fell. Eleanor screamed. Adrian seized her arm and pulled her behind him. "Stay close," he commanded, guiding her toward the far corner of the room as Cedric Vale staggered into the doorway. Rain dripped from his coat, mixing with blood at his temple. His eyes held a feral gleam, wild and unhinged. "There you are," Cedric slurred, a grotesque smile twisting his face. "My runaway wife. And the Duke who stole her." Adrian stepped in front of Eleanor in a single, fluid motion. "You will not take another step," he warned, his voice sharp as steel. Cedric laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "You think you can keep her from me? She is mine." "She was never yours," Adrian said coldly. Cedric lunged, brandishing the stolen pistol with trembling fury. Adrian moved faster, grappling with him as the gun swung wildly. The two men crashed against the table, sending books scattering. Eleanor cried out, frozen between terror and the instinct to intervene. The struggle was brutal, raw strength against disciplined resolve, until Cedric wrenched free and pointed the gun directly at Eleanor. Time shattered. Eleanor felt her breath stop. Adrian threw himself between them just as the gun fired. The gunshot tore through the air with a violent finality, louder than thunder, sharper than any scream. Eleanor felt the world fracture around her as Adrian's body lurched backward into her arms, his weight knocking the breath from her lungs. For one suspended heartbeat she could not move, could not think, only stare at the widening bloom of crimson staining the white of his shirt. Her hands shook violently as she wrapped her arms around him, lowering him to the floor with desperate gentleness. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice breaking into shards. "Adrian, stay with me." His breath hitched, uneven and shallow, yet his eyes, dark, steadfast, unbearably tender. Even now sought hers with a clarity that turned her heart inside out. Cedric staggered, the pistol slipping from his grasp as the recoil jarred his already fraying senses. He blinked at the scene before him with something like disbelief. "He threw himself in front of you," he muttered, voice slurring with rage and shock. "He bled for you." Eleanor's grief ignited into something fierce, something blazing. She rose to her feet with trembling strength, positioning herself between Adrian and Cedric as guards rushed in from every corridor, their boots pounding like approaching thunder. Cedric snarled, lunging forward, but two guards seized him, wrestling him to the ground as he fought with the desperation of a man who had already lost. "She is mine," he shouted, voice cracking in delusional fury. "She is mine." "No," Eleanor said, her voice trembling yet unwavering. "I was never yours." Cedric froze at her words, the madness in his eyes flickering into something hollow. The guards bound him in irons, dragging him away as he screamed empty threats that dissolved into the storm outside. But Eleanor heard none of it. She dropped to her knees beside Adrian, her hands immediately returning to his, her breath trembling as she pressed her forehead to his. "Hold on," she pleaded, her tears falling onto his skin like warm rain. "Please, Adrian, stay with me." His fingers weakly curled around hers, the faintest thread of strength holding him to consciousness. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice rasping with pain, "are you harmed?" The question broke her entirely. Even in agony, his first thought was her. "No," she managed, choking on the words. "I'm safe, because of you." She pressed her hands against the wound, desperate to stop the bleeding, desperate to anchor him to her. He winced, breath tightening, yet his gaze never wavered. "Good," he murmured, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Then, I do not regret it." More guards burst into the room, followed by Halston and the estate physician, who immediately knelt beside them. "Your Grace," the physician stammered, "we must move him, quickly." Eleanor refused to release Adrian's hand as they lifted him onto a stretcher. "He saved my life," she whispered, her voice shaking with a grief too fierce to contain. "Save his." As they carried Adrian away, Eleanor followed close behind, her heart clinging to every rise and fall of his breath. Cedric was gone. The danger had passed. But the man who had protected her with his own body now hovered between life and death, and she could not imagine a world without him. The hours following the gunshot bled into one another, heavy and disorienting, as though the world held its breath in the dim corridors of Ravensford Hall. Eleanor paced outside the physician's chamber, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. The scent of antiseptic herbs mingled with the low murmur of urgent voices behind the door. Every rise and fall of those voices stretched her nerves thinner, every moment without news pressing her heart deeper into dread. Mary hovered nearby, offering comfort that Eleanor could scarcely absorb. She felt suspended between hope and despair, each minute stretching unbearably as she replayed Adrian's collapse over and over, the image carved into her memory with agonizing clarity. When at last the physician emerged, Eleanor straightened with a breath that felt like it might break her ribs. The man removed his spectacles, exhaustion etched into his expression. "He lives," the physician said softly. The bullet lodged high in the shoulder, painful, but not fatal with care. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. Relief struck her so powerfully she had to brace herself against the wall. "May I see him?" she whispered. The physician nodded, stepping aside. Inside, Adrian lay propped against pillows, his skin pale but no longer ghost-like. A thick bandage wrapped his shoulder, and his breath, though shallow, came steady. His eyes fluttered open when she approached, and for a moment he simply studied her, as if reassuring himself she was truly there. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice hoarse but warm with recognition. She sank into the chair at his bedside, unable to stop the tears that slipped silently down her cheeks. "I feared," she broke off, unable to finish. Adrian raised his good hand, brushing his fingers gently against her wrist. "I am still here," he whispered. "I promised I would protect you. I intend to keep that promise for far longer yet." She laughed softly through her tears, the sound trembling but real. "You nearly died," she said. "For me." Adrian held her gaze, his expression quiet but fierce. "You are worth the risk." The simple truth in his tone stole her breath. She lowered her forehead to their joined hands, letting the silence settle around them like a fragile blessing. In that stillness, the fear that had ruled her life for so long began to loosen its grip, replaced by something tender and steady, a promise of days not defined by terror. Weeks passed, and Adrian regained his strength with stubborn determination. Cedric, facing overwhelming evidence and the uproar of public outrage, was sentenced swiftly. Eleanor's annulment was granted without contest. Ravensford Hall became her new home, not by necessity but by choice. She walked the gardens freely now, the scent of lavender mingling with the warming air of spring. On one such morning, Adrian joined her beneath the budding rose arbor. He offered his hand, not as a shield, not as a rescuer, but as a man who loved her without restraint. "Eleanor," he said softly, "may I have the honor of walking beside you for the rest of my life?" Her smile bloomed like the roses around them. "Yes," she whispered, placing her hand in his, "for the rest of mine too." And so the woman once forced into darkness found her light, in a love chosen freely, bravely, beautifully.